All our stories are created for entertainment purposes only.
Joyce and I have been married for 2 years now. We had already been living together before tying the knot, so the transition from cohabitation to marriage wasn't all that challenging. However, our different career paths have led to some ups and downs along the way. We were college sweethearts, and we decided to get married right after graduating. Looking back, I sometimes think that was a hasty decision. Maybe I should have heeded my friend's advice to experience a few heartbreaks before settling down. Oh, how I wish I could turn back time and follow that guidance. Anyway, let's get back to where I left off. We got married at the age of 22, which now seems pretty young and naive. Joyce was my first and only girlfriend, and she was quite popular in college. When we first met, she was already in a relationship with someone else. We got paired up for a project, and that's how our connection began. Despite her popularity and her existing relationship, we developed a deep bond as we worked on the project. Over time, we realized that what we had was truly special, and we decided to take a chance on each other. Her overly possessive boyfriend would often show up whenever we had to work together, which eventually led to their breakup. With a bit of newfound confidence, I finally mustered the courage to ask her out on a date. She agreed to just one date, not wanting to jeopardize our friendship. Our first date was a movie, and I strategically chose it for the darkness that would allow me to hold her hand. Those were some good times, I must admit. To my surprise, she didn't pull away when I made my move, and in that moment, I knew she was the one. I did everything in my power to win her heart, and eventually, she fell in love with me. That love led us to get married at a very young age. During college, Joyce had been living with her mother, Evelyn, who was a single mother. Evelyn had become pregnant with Joyce at the age of 15 and had been taking care of her ever since. Joyce's father had abandoned any responsibility for the pregnancy, leaving Evelyn to raise Joyce on her own. Evelyn was a stay-at-home mom, and I couldn't fathom how she managed to put Joyce through college without a stable job. However, I never questioned or judged her about it, as it wasn't my place to pry into their family affairs. They were incredibly close, having relied on each other for support throughout the years. Despite their tight bond, I couldn't help but feel that something was off about Evelyn. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but our initial encounters had left me with a nagging sense of unease. Despite my initial reservations, I respected the strong bond between Joyce and Evelyn and made an effort to keep an open mind about their relationship. During our dating phase, I had to pick up Joyce for a party. I arrived at her house and was directed to sit in the living room by Evelyn. Joyce was still in her room getting ready, and I was asked to wait for another 15 minutes until she was ready. Evelyn struck up a conversation with me about my interests, dislikes, and such. At first, I thought it was just a protective mom wanting to get to know her daughter's boyfriend. As our conversation continued, I began to sense that Evelyn was trying to bridge the gap between us. It made me feel nervous and oddly comfortable at the same time. Something didn't feel quite right. I started to wonder if Evelyn might be making advances towards me. The more she tried to connect with me, the more I questioned whether I had completely misread the situation. Perhaps it was some kind of test I needed to pass to earn Evelyn's approval to date her daughter. Those 15 minutes felt like an eternity. When Joyce finally came downstairs, I felt relieved and immediately stood up to leave. Evelyn hugged Joyce and whispered something in her ear, which I assumed were the results of my character and loyalty test. I mentally kicked myself for entertaining such absurd thoughts about my girlfriend's mother and quickly made my exit with a sheepish grin. After our graduation from college, Joyce and I decided to start living together. It made sense because I lived closer to the college, and we thought it would be a good way to save money. We both agreed that we would get married after college, so we could begin our life together as a couple without waiting for the perfect moment. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if I was under some sort of spell or influenced by black magic to make that decision. Following our graduation, we set a wedding date and had a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and family. We made some adjustments to our house to make it more suitable for a married couple. Finding a job with a decent salary was a bit challenging without much experience. It took some time, but I eventually landed a job that aligned with my aspirations and offered a reasonable income. Joyce was in the process of securing a job for herself, but she also wanted hands-on experience in hairdressing. She had dreams of starting her own salon someday. I, on the other hand, had started working for a construction company. My role involved visiting various construction sites to oversee safety measures and monitor project progress. It was my responsibility to ensure everything ran smoothly and that we could meet the deadlines promised to our clients. The job was demanding but far from a mundane desk job, and it allowed me to stay active due to all the on-site walking. After a year of hard work, my boss, Brian, recognized my efforts and promoted me. Brian, who was in his late 50s, inherited the company from his father. He was a demanding boss who always had suggestions for improvement. To show my appreciation for the promotion, I invited Brian to dinner at our house. At first, he hesitated, but after some persistence, he agreed to join us on a Friday evening. When Friday arrived, Brian showed up alone, without his wife. I didn't want Joyce to feel left out or bored during the dinner, so I was pleasantly surprised by Brian's different demeanor that evening. He was jovial, accommodating, and far from his usual work persona of being constantly unhappy and complaining. To my surprise, he even brought a bottle of wine, which was unexpected. We enjoyed our dinner and then moved to the backyard where we set up a drinks table. As we finished the bottle of wine, I went inside to get another drink. When I returned, I noticed that my boss and Joyce were engrossed in a conversation. Joyce was sharing her aspirations of becoming a hairdresser and her plans to open her salon once she found a suitable investor. Brian appeared genuinely interested, so I decided not to interrupt their conversation. I poured the drinks and joined in, trying to be a part of this engaging discussion. It was as if I had become invisible because they were so deeply involved in their conversation. Listening to Joyce passionately discuss her dreams was inspiring, and I couldn't help but admire her determination and ambition. What surprised me even more was seeing my boss genuinely engaged, offering valuable advice and encouragement. I saw this conversation as an excellent opportunity for Joyce to showcase her potential, and secretly, I was hoping that my boss might become her investor. As the evening progressed, the discussion shifted from my recent promotion to Joyce's plans for her salon. When it was time for my boss to leave, he surprised us by asking Joyce to prepare a presentation and meet with him in his office the following week for further discussions. He wanted details on potential salon locations, equipment costs, and the staffing requirements for the salon's initial setup. Joyce eagerly accepted the task and assured my boss that she would put together a thorough presentation with all the necessary information. As we said our goodbyes that night, I couldn't help but feel excited about the possibilities that lay ahead for Joyce and her new venture. Both of us were thrilled about how the evening had unfolded, and we celebrated with a few more drinks, marking the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. In the following weeks, Joyce worked diligently on her presentation, while I continued with my responsibilities in my new position. Our busy work schedules kept us occupied. Joyce eventually presented her proposal to Brian, who agreed to invest in her hairdressing salon. The salon opened in a prime location, and Joyce took on the role of managing everything until she could hire a capable manager. Meanwhile, my work required me to travel frequently to different cities, which meant I was often away from home. During this time, I noticed that Joyce and Brian had developed a closer bond. It no longer seemed like a typical investor-business owner relationship. I began to have concerns about the amount of time my boss was spending at Joyce's salon, and it started to bother me. I decided to have a conversation with Joyce, expressing my unease and asking if there was something more than a professional relationship between her and Brian. Joyce dismissed my concerns, suggesting that I was overthinking things. According to her, Brian's focus was on when he would start seeing returns on his investment. He was analyzing the market and offering advice on how to boost sales. Despite her explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that Joyce was devoting too much time to her partnership with Brian, which left me questioning the priorities in our relationship. With Joyce's business thriving, she became much busier than before, and it started causing friction between us. I could see cracks forming in our relationship. We began arguing over who was putting in more effort. My boss had been sending me on frequent business trips to different locations, which limited the time I could spend with Joyce. The emotional and physical distance between us was growing. Our conversations became shorter and less frequent, and it felt like we were drifting apart. I missed the deep connection we once had. One day, during a business trip, I decided to surprise Joyce with a video call from my hotel room. I wanted to show her the beautiful sea view from my room. She rejected my calls twice, which struck me as odd since I knew her salon would be closed, and she should have been at home. She eventually answered on my third attempt, but seemed distracted and disinterested. She kept looking away, as if something else had captured her attention, which bothered me. In the background, I noticed something unusual that didn't belong in our bedroom, a pair of men's boxers. I knew they couldn't be mine because I hadn't worn boxers since I was a teenager. Furthermore, I was certain Joyce didn't own any boxers. I made a mental note to ask her about it when I returned from my business trip. Upon my return, I spotted Brian's car parked outside Joyce's salon. I headed inside and inquired with the receptionist about Joyce's whereabouts, even though I already knew where she would be. As I approached her office, I overheard the receptionist notifying her that I was on my way, as if it were a scheduled appointment. It struck me as odd, but I assumed it was standard procedure, and the receptionist was just doing her job. I knocked on the door and let myself in. After all, it was my wife's cabin, and I didn't need permission to enter. I noticed Brian and Joyce sitting on the sofa, going through some files. I greeted Brian and went over to hug Joyce. While hugging her, I noticed the file they were looking at, which happened to be upside down. I thought, that's an interesting way to handle business. I took a seat across from them on the sofa, hoping that Brian would leave soon, giving us some privacy. Instead, he surprised me by asking for a report on my recent business trip to be submitted by tomorrow morning. I agreed to it, knowing that he was still my boss, and I had to follow his orders. I patiently waited for Joyce to wrap up her meeting with Brian so we could have some time to ourselves. After a few minutes, they said their goodbyes with a warm hug, which left me quite baffled. I knew they were business partners, but I had no idea they were this friendly. It was a side of both Joyce and Brian that I wasn't too thrilled about. In a sarcastic tone, I made a comment to Joyce about her being overly friendly and willing to hug just about anyone and anything. She looked puzzled, and her expression remained blank. I decided to let it slide for the moment, not wanting to start an argument right after returning. I asked if she'd like to leave with me right away so we could have some quality time together. She enthusiastically agreed, and we headed to a fancy restaurant since we hadn't been able to do that in a while. We spent a lot of time together, catching up on what had been going on in our lives during the past few days. I eventually brought up the topic of her closeness with Brian. Joyce mentioned that he was actually a nice person once you got to know him outside of work. She explained that he had some ideas to help grow the business, and they had been working on them for a while, expecting positive results. As she spoke, I couldn't help but feel like she was avoiding giving me a direct answer, which only fueled my doubts about their relationship. I wanted to avoid causing a scene in public, so I played along with whatever she said. But the nagging thought of figuring out what was really happening never left my mind, not even for a second. Things got even more complicated at work when I started noticing I was getting the lion's share of projects, most of them in different cities. It was weird because there were people with way more experience than me who could handle them better. I couldn't quite figure out if Brian was piling work on me to help me grow professionally or to keep me too occupied to spend time with Joyce. Their relationship remained a complete enigma, and I knew I had to unravel it myself. Complaining to my boss about my workload would only tarnish my professionalism, so I came up with a risky plan. My plan was to deliberately make mistakes in my work so that I'd get taken off some of the projects. This would give me the breathing space I needed to investigate the Joyce and Brian situation. So, that's exactly what I did for the next few days, and boy did I mess up big time. My manager had no choice but to report my incompetence to Brian, and he had to reduce my project load. It seemed like my plan was making progress, at least for now. The following day, as I was heading to work, I decided to call my manager and inform him that I had a flat tire. I was strangely proud of how smoothly I lied without hesitation. It was like I was becoming a master at making up excuses just to keep tabs on Joyce and Brian. I parked my car on the opposite side of the street from Joyce's salon, ensuring I had a clear view of the entrance. I grabbed a sandwich on the way and patiently waited in my car, even though the salon was supposed to be closed that day. I had this gut feeling that Joyce would definitely show up, and I couldn't help but wonder how I would handle the situation if there truly was something going on between her and Brian. I waited for what felt like an eternity, almost giving up hope, when I finally saw Joyce pulling into the parking lot in front of the salon. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, disappearing from my view. At that moment, all I could do was sit there and wait for Brian's arrival, a prospect I was strangely confident about. Deep down, though, I still clung to a glimmer of hope that what I feared might not actually come to pass. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly, and then, finally, I spotted Brian maneuvering his car into the parking space right behind Joyce's vehicle. He parked, casually exited the car, and locked the salon's entrance. It was as if my heart sank deeper into my chest as the reality of the situation began to set in. I continued to wait, my anxiety growing with each passing second. After approximately 5 agonizing minutes, curiosity and a gnawing sense of betrayal got the better of me. I had prepared for this possibility and knew where to find a spare key to the salon. Quietly, I retrieved it from its hiding place and cautiously approached Joyce's office. Their laughter and lively conversation seeped through the closed door. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open ever so slightly, just enough to get a discreet glimpse inside. What I witnessed was exactly what I had suspected, but the emotional impact was far more devastating than I had ever imagined. Joyce sat on the table, her legs spread wide, while Brian stood between them. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks, and my heart ached with a pain I couldn't have prepared for. I knew that if I wanted any chance of confronting them, I needed undeniable evidence. Pulling out my phone, trembling with a mix of emotions, I began recording the shocking scene before me. It was gut-wrenching to witness the love of my life in such an intimate embrace with my boss. My heart grew heavier as I continued filming, capturing each painful moment, their kisses, the gradual removal of their clothes, and Brian kneeling down. I reached a breaking point, unable to bear the torment any longer. My breathing became rapid, and it felt as if I might have a stroke right then and there. I stumbled out of the room, my insides churning, and began retching uncontrollably. Seeing someone you love and trust cheating, acting normal in your presence, is an indescribable agony. I couldn't help but feel like I would award Joyce an Oscar for her masterful act of playing the perfect partner while secretly betraying me with my boss. Reflecting on our journey together, I racked my brain for any shortcomings or mistakes on my part that might have driven Joyce to cheat. I'd always been attentive, caring, and supportive of her decisions, even when they clashed with my own beliefs. Love, to me, meant being there through thick and thin, and it was baffling to contemplate what had led to this heartbreaking betrayal. In my opinion, being there for each other, no matter how foolish the other person may seem, I realized I didn't deserve this situation, and I definitely shouldn't accept it. I stayed in my car and drove to work because I didn't have the courage to face Joyce or Brian at that moment. To distract myself, I tried focusing on the project I was currently working on, but it became increasingly difficult to concentrate. When I got back home, I was filled with disappointment and sadness. Surprisingly, Joyce had come home early and wanted to cook dinner for both of us. I made an effort to act normal, pretending as if nothing had happened, and tried to be the loving and caring husband she always expected me to be. My heart felt shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I couldn't help but think that it would be incredibly challenging for me to trust and love someone in the future. I had genuinely believed that Joyce was my soulmate, and we would enjoy a lifetime of happiness together. Unfortunately, that dream had been shattered, along with my hopes for a shared future. I could feel anger building up inside me, and I had no idea how to release all the negativity that was consuming me, growing with each passing minute. It had been 3 long days since I witnessed Joyce's betrayal, and I remained clueless about what steps to take to rid myself of this anger and frustration. Just as I pondered this, the doorbell rang unexpectedly, and I went to answer it, wondering who would show up so early on a Sunday morning. When I opened the door, I saw Evelyn standing there holding 2 large bags of groceries. I motioned for her to come inside, not really in the mood for conversation. I quickly came up with an excuse to avoid engaging with her, and that's when a brilliant idea struck me like lightning. I knew precisely what I wanted to do to exact my sweet revenge. I had always believed in the principle of giving back what you receive, and if possible, doubling it. It was time for me to live by that principle. I excused myself from Evelyn and headed to my room, ready to put my plan into action. I needed some time alone to come up with a plan. Joyce was still sleeping after a long day at the salon yesterday, and I knew exactly what had kept her busy. It certainly wasn't work, that's for sure. So, I saw an opportunity to use Evelyn's interest in me to my advantage. I began laying the groundwork for my plan, thinking about what I hoped to achieve. One thing was crystal clear. I wanted Joyce to feel the same level of pain I felt when I saw her with Brian. I wanted her to experience the heartbreak I had endured when she saw me with someone else. In the evening, when Evelyn was getting ready to leave, I surprised both Joyce and Evelyn by suggesting that she stay with us for a few days. They both knew I had been uncomfortable around Evelyn in the past, so this was quite a shock. Evelyn tried to politely decline, but I made sure to appear genuinely interested in having her stay with us. It seemed to work, and Evelyn agreed to spend a few nights under our roof. My plan was finally in motion, and all I had to do was be as good to Evelyn as possible, making her believe that there was mutual attraction between us. When Joyce asked why I had invited Evelyn, I explained that I didn't want to make things awkward between them due to my discomfort. I wanted to be more open to Evelyn's presence and hoped it would ease the tension between us. Joyce raised an eyebrow, but seemed content that I was giving her mother a chance. Joyce had her hands full with her affair and was doing her best to keep it hidden from me. She didn't have much time to deal with me, given that she had Brian on her mind. It had been 2 days since Evelyn moved in with us, and I continued to make an effort to be close to her, all part of my plan. I'd accidentally touch her hand while making breakfast, bump into her coming out of my room, or sit a bit too close on the couch when watching TV. I was testing the waters, trying to see if Evelyn was catching on to my hints. It felt like I was fishing, waiting for her to take the bait. Evelyn, my wife's mother, had always been making advances toward me, even when my wife and I were dating. I found it weird, but brushed it off because I loved my wife and wanted to stay loyal to her. I knew that Joyce trusted only a couple of people in her life, and I didn't want to break her heart by revealing her mom's behavior. All I had to do was ignore Evelyn's advances, and things wouldn't escalate. But I decided to take a risk and try to seduce Evelyn, which wasn't too hard, to be honest. I knew she'd jump at any chance if she even sensed my interest. She didn't care much about relationships and wouldn't think twice about trying to seduce her daughter's husband. She'd always looked at me with desire, and she'd be thrilled to know I felt the same way about her. So I decided to give her some signals. I knew there was no turning back once I went down this path. Looking back, Evelyn was quite a catch. She was only 38 years old and still incredibly attractive. At least she wasn't my mother's age, which made me more comfortable with my plan. I knew I was being a bit cruel by using Evelyn's longing for companionship, but I felt like I had no other choice. This was the only way I could make Joyce understand what it felt like to betray someone you truly love. I tried to lure her using my body, too. After a run, I'd come home, take off my shirt, and walk over to the fridge to grab some water. Evelyn would be preparing breakfast, stealing glances at my physique. I'd approach her, whispering "Good morning" in her ear as I reached for a coffee mug from the rack above her. As I watched Evelyn eagerly anticipate our encounters and shower me with affection, guilt began to eat at me. I couldn't help but question my decision to manipulate her emotions for my own agenda. Nevertheless, I believed that desperate times called for desperate measures, and I remained determined to teach Joyce a valuable lesson. It was a moment I knew she'd never forget. The final step of my plan was in motion. I sent a message to Joyce by accident, asking her to meet me at home since she was at her salon and wouldn't be back until later that night. I made sure she read the message and then deleted it. Innocently, I followed up with another message, assuring her that I'd see her tonight after work. To make it convincing, I called in sick at my job and told Evelyn I needed her help with something important. I was well aware that Joyce might check with Brian if I showed up at work to confirm the message I sent her. I calculated the time it would take for Joyce to reach home from her salon, making sure I was prepared before her arrival. I had breakfast with Evelyn to show my interest. I complimented her, saying she looked gorgeous even at her age, and added that if it weren't for Joyce, I would have been interested in her. She blushed, and I could sense the tension building. To keep things under control until the right moment, I decided to leave Evelyn alone and started preparing in my room. I discreetly tracked Joyce's phone location to see if she was on her way home. Then I pretended to injure my back while pulling up the sheets and called out to Evelyn for help. I wanted to make her believe I was genuinely hurt and in need of her assistance. She tried to help me sit on the bed, and this was my chance to turn up the heat. I fell onto the bed in such a way that she couldn't resist what I had in mind. Our faces were inches apart, and I could tell that Evelyn was ready to take the chance. I allowed her to kiss me, not wanting to be the first one to cross that line. It might seem foolish, but I still hesitated to betray my wife. Evelyn's lips met mine, and I began to escalate things further. I estimated that it would take another 10 minutes for Joyce to arrive home, giving me the time I needed to carry out the rest of my plan. I made sure Joyce had no clue about the increasing tension between Evelyn and me. All this time, she had no idea what she would walk in on once she got home. Suddenly, I heard the screeching of car brakes in our driveway. It was my signal to kick things up a notch. I started undressing Evelyn, and she responded with moans of pleasure. While footsteps echoed on the stairs, I tried to distract Evelyn from them. Joyce ended up catching us in a compromising position right in our own bed. Surprisingly, that was part of the plan, to get caught in our own house and our own bed. I couldn't help but wonder how many times Brian and Joyce had been intimate in that very bed while I was away on business. Joyce stood there, a mix of shock and anger painted on her face. A sense of victory washed over me, despite the turmoil. She screamed loudly, snapping Evelyn and me out of our daze. Evelyn hastily covered herself, and Joyce wore a horrified expression. She berated us, questioning how we could betray her trust. We were the only people she believed in, and we had let her down. Evelyn seemed genuinely sorry, about to explain herself when I interrupted. I confessed that I felt the same way when I saw her and Brian making out in her office. The color drained from her face as she realized I knew about her secret affair. She accused me, claiming I was making up stories to cover my own actions. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at her denial. To prove the truth, I showed her the video I had filmed, finally forcing her to admit it. She claimed it wasn't her intention to cheat, insisting it was because he was investing in her business. But I wasn't buying it, as their interactions didn't seem forced at all. She seemed to enjoy his company, going to lavish dinners under the pretense of business meetings and accepting expensive gifts from him. What did she even see in him? My boss was seriously old, way too old to be a grandfather to our kids. How on earth could my wife even consider cheating on me with him? Sure, he had money, but that doesn't mean you jump into bed with anyone just because they're throwing cash your way. I was beyond crushed, to say the least. I'm not going to deny it. There was some satisfaction in getting back at Joyce for what she did in our relationship. They say a lifetime isn't enough to truly understand someone, and I'm starting to believe it. I can't help but wonder if my financial stability was the sole reason my wife left her boyfriend and agreed to marry me. Was that it? Or did she ever genuinely love me? I know I won't find answers to these questions in this lifetime. I'll have to come to terms with the fact that my wife cheated on me with my wealthy boss. The only guilt I carry right now is what I did to Evelyn. I know I used her for my own gain, and I wish there were an easier way to seek revenge. Seeing Joyce all alone and unable to confide in her mother after what she did provided some satisfaction. I contemplated quitting my job, but then decided against it because I wasn't the one at fault here. As for where to go from here, Joyce left home that day and hasn't contacted me since. Evelyn, too, felt too ashamed and left immediately after the incident. It's a challenging situation, and I'm not quite sure what my next steps should be.